Good morning. It's June 16th. This is To My Liberal Friends. Well, the shootings that took place in Minnesota last week are a stain on our political discourse. The media and some politicians have already claimed they were politically motivated, and they may be true. They did find a political manifesto along with a list of other politicians in the perpetrator's vehicle, so the evidence indicates it was probably a political act. But we've reached a point in our political discussion that's a dangerous level. The rhetoric that's used on both sides of the political divide have become more and more harsh. The problem with this type of comments is that for a small segment of the population, it incites them to take drastic actions that result in the deaths of innocent people. The suspect, Vance Luther Bolter, has a long history of security training. In the past, he was appointed to the state's Workforce Development Board by two governors, both Democrats. He was first appointed by Governor Mark Dayton in 2016 and reappointed by Governor Tim Walz in 2019. He apparently knocked on the door of the home of Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark and fatally shot them. He also shot Minnesota State Senator John Hoffman, his wife. Bolter served on the state board with Hoffman. He's been captured now, so we'll get a better idea of what was his motivations. In recent years, we have seen a rise in political violence. We all remember when a man knocked on the door of Nancy Pelosi's home in San Francisco and attacked her husband with a hammer. Just last summer, a young man came perilously close to assassinating then-candidate Donald Trump, and a second attempt was later made on his life down in Florida. In my opinion, things started to go downhill in 2000 when Democrats convinced themselves that George W. Bush had stolen the election from Al Gore. The staff members in the White House for Bill Clinton removed all the W's from the computer keyboards as a form of protest. They had assumed they would keep their jobs if Gore had won. The rhetoric on the floor of the House and Senate became more acute, and the media began a constant barrage of negative attacks on Republicans. And I don't absolve Republicans because many of them on the far right of the political spectrum engage in similar attacks, sometimes against Democrats, in many cases against fellow Republicans who they call rhinos, Republicans in name only, if they dare to disagree with them on any issue. On the left, we see the schism within the Democratic Party, where the left-wing progressives are demanding that all Democrats, including any moderates, engage in full resistance to the Trump administration. Donald Trump himself is also guilty of inflaming the emotions of people. His name-calling of anyone that disagrees with him is anything but presidential. Just this past week, he spoke at Fort Bragg to mark the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army. Instead of giving an uplifting speech celebrating the anniversary, he went on the attack with a litany of subjects. He was partisan to the extreme where he did not need to be. He failed to understand that the military is not political, and a president should never put members of the military in a position where they are pressed or encouraged to show allegiance to one man or one party. All of this inflammatory speech and rhetoric has to stop. When I first went to Washington, D.C. in 1977, there were political divides, but there was also camaraderie and friendship across the aisle. My boss at the time was Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah. He became the chairman of the Labor and Human Resources Committee in 1980, and the ranking member was Senator Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts. They differed politically, but were able to forge a long-lasting friendship, and as a byproduct passed some extremely crucial legislation. They did this by talking and compromising on some issues to get to the end goal. They did not huff and puff that if changes were not made to the bills to comply with everything they wanted, they would vote no. Hear that, members of the Freedom Caucus? Hear that, members of the Progressive Caucus? Start talking to each other. A few years ago, I went back to Washington, D.C. While I was there, I went to visit Jim Clyburn, a Democrat from South Carolina. Jim's wife, Emily, had recently passed away, and Jim is a longtime friend. At the end of the meeting, he was told that Congresswoman Rashid Tlaib was outside waiting to meet with him. As we walked out, he put his arm around me and said, "Just watch this." We walked out the door. Congresswoman Tlaib was sitting on a bench. She stood up, and Jim said, "Let me introduce to you my favorite Republican." And she pulled her hand back. She wouldn't even shake my hand. As we walked down the hall to the elevator that came up to his office, he said, "This is what we're dealing with now." And if you read the media, you see them calling Trump a Nazi or fascist. And then this becomes something Democrats in general use on a regular basis. You hear Democrats calling for people to confront Trump administration officials in the public. If you see them in a restaurant, get in their face. We have restaurants who refuse to take reservations from Trump officials because of their politics. Could you imagine the outrage if they refused reservations on the basis of race? We have families that are split in half over politics. It shouldn't be. Here in Utah, Governor Spencer Cox has stated that we have to learn to disagree better. For that comment, he was booed and roundly criticized by Republican delegates to the state convention. They're part of the problem as well because they see only things through their narrow prism. You're all in with them or anything on everything or you're not welcome. We're at a point in time where politicians need to tone down what they're saying. They need to learn what the other side has a point of view and does not make them evil in any way. It's just that they differ. We hold elections to decide which point of view the public wants at that moment in time. So the next time you hear a friend or family speak so harshly or derogatorily about the opposing party or candidate, it becomes imperative that you caution them. As Governor Cox said, we have to learn to disagree better. We need to learn to be civil and respectful. It does not mean you have to change your opinion, but it does mean that others are allowed to have their own opinions. This has been To My Liberal Friends. Thanks for listening.